one of the most potent forms of activism that we have available is not only doing our personal healing work and tending to our own hearts, working on our own self, our self-development, but then also living that out in a way where we tighten and strengthen the bonds, not just in our family, but in our community around us. And then start to think about, okay, how do we improve the lives of our children? How do we tend to the environment in which we live? How do we improve the quality of our lives? How do we improve the quality of our health? And that,
All right, welcome to Clarity. This is a podcast for reclaiming our focus, rediscovering our sense of purpose, and learning to navigate the confusions of life with resilience. And today I'm sitting down with my good friend John Hazim, and he is a somatic coach, retreat facilitator, and ceremonialist who works at the intersection of emotional resilience, somatic healing, and transformational group work. John has been heavily involved in men's work in the form of retreats and one-on-one coaching, and he blends honest dialogue, breath work, nature-based practices, and plant medicine ceremonies to help bring individuals through emotional numbness, reconnect with their purpose, and build lives rooted in clarity and connection. John, how are you doing on your side?
well, man, it's a pleasure to connect with you.
John, can you walk us a little bit through your personal path of what got you into coaching and the world of healing and facilitation?
Mhm.
Were there any key moments or mentors that shifted you to that course in your life?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll try to be concise. I think where it most obviously began is, certainly there were like little things from my childhood that led me down this path, but I'll say one of the most obvious kind of turning points in my early 20s. I was just coming out of one of the longest term relationships that I had been in. So it had been a few years and that relationship was ending. A lot of my identity was wrapped up in that relationship. At that same time, my grandfather had just passed away, who was like the primary kind of masculine figure in my life. And I was just struggling. I was going to college, but I was switching my major every semester. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. Um, and I was just very aimless. And I think that with all those things that I just mentioned, it just became very unsettling. And I started to develop like anxiety and insomnia, very severe like social anxiety of just like even to show up to class, I would be like really uncomfortable and I would get sweaty. And it was like a really troubling time. And I found yoga around that time, which was helpful, but it was still not really addressing like the core issue. And I had dabbled with plant medicines as far as like psilocybin mushrooms. They had grown locally here and I had, had an opportunity to experience those, but not like in a traditional ceremonial setting. But those were helpful. I think that started to kind of broaden my horizon. But in any case, I started to hear about ayahuasca through podcasts. I think it was like Aubrey Marcus initially. And it just really resonated with me. It was really interesting to me. And it just felt like it was what I needed to do. I should also add that up until that point, I was very like kind of just introverted and had been living very a kind of shy lifestyle, I want to say. Uh, which I bring that up because I think to go to the jungle, to the Amazon jungle, to go do ayahuasca when I actually didn't know anyone who had done that before was like it was like the boldest thing that I had done up until that point. And so for a variety of reasons, I ended up going again for a week-long retreat, a few ayahuasca ceremonies, a combo ceremony in there. Between the potency of those medicine experiences and the visions and all of that, but also the potency of just being in the Amazon jungle, this wild place. I'd never even tasted anything close to that, where we would be on excursions and like otters would jump into the boat with us, and you'd see piranhas and you saw pink dolphins, and the food was so just like delicious and local, and the people were so friendly and kind, and um, it was just like this hero's journey, for me. And at the end of that week, I basically knew that I was going to live there and that I had some further work to do there. And so I came home and I sold all my belongings and I sold my car and I left my job and I got a one-way ticket, and I came back, a few months later, and slowly but surely I got jobs, kind of volunteering at different ayahuasca centers. And then eventually I had a paid position at Amaru Spirit where I was teaching yoga and I was doing some of the kind of onboarding and hosting of people, and offering combo ultimately as well. And so that was like a big turning point for me, was a year and a half that I lived in Peru, where I kind of developed these skill sets. My kind of just whole paradigm shifted, my whole trajectory shifted. And so then that really opened things up for me. So that was the kind of the beginning. And so over those few years then too, where eventually it led me to Costa Rica to facilitate ayahuasca ceremonies at Soltara. Some friends that had owned a center in Peru now owned and opened a center in Costa Rica. And we led retreats for Dennis McKenna and Joe Tafur and a number of just really, beautiful leaders in that space. Then there came a point through this process, I became a dad as well. So through this process, came it became apparent that it was time to sort of come back to the States. Our son was coming of age that he needed to be in school, and it just felt like it was the right move for our family and for him in particular. And that was a really challenging process of like going from, you know, ayahuasca ceremonies and this beautiful kind of, whether we were in Costa Rica or Peru, it was just like this beautiful lifestyle, living very naturally, you know, to now kind of figuring out, what ultimately I became a salesperson is what the first job that I got. And so like how to reintegrate back into the matrix was really challenging, and how to be a father was really challenging. And so this brings me now to this phase of the men's work and how that entered my field. Because I think for me, I really struggled reintegrating back into society. And I think though the plant medicine experiences were really helpful and helped me to develop in a certain way, I was underdeveloped in certain other ways, and maybe we might call these more masculine qualities of like integrity, hard work, structure, consistency, you know, doing the hard thing. I think I hadn't really developed that. I didn't really have my father in my life. I didn't have at that time like brothers, to hold me accountable and to challenge me and to push me and to inspire me. And in the early stages of that, I didn't know that I was lacking that, but I came across the Mankind Project and went on one of their retreats, and that was the first like men's work experience that I had been a part of, and that was really potent for me. Really beautiful experience. I think they do really good work, and so not long after that, I started to host a local men's circle here. I did that for a few years, ultimately led a few retreats, which you were a part of. And so it just found that like that was just really nourishing work for me, just to kind of become more fully embodied in my character and my values. And just in general, I think also to have the opportunity to lead other men and to teach. I think as we develop these capacities, we sort of have like a responsibility to kind of share and to inspire others and challenge others. And so yeah, that drew me now into this men's work field. So really these days I'm kind of blending all of these experiences. I'm hosting retreats, plant medicine retreats. I'm still very much involved in men's work. I'm now affiliated with the Sacred Sons. I do some men's coaching, but also some somatic coaching, so kind of body-based coaching one-on-one, which I really enjoy that work. I think it's really beautiful to take part in retreats and have these peak experiences, but I think it's also really important, right? The integration. How do we like bring that and anchor that into our reality and our day to day? And I think a huge valuable component of that is having a guide or some kind of professional support to help process, the challenges that arise when we're trying to show up in a new way in our day to day, in our life, in our work. So yeah, I hopefully that gives some context to where I'm coming from and where I'm at.
Powerful journey. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And it started with you going down to Central America and South America and experiencing these transformational, not only travel in terms of transformation, but psychedelic journeys or plant medicine journeys as well. And these are things that absolutely shake your world. And you not only experienced the inner transformation, you experienced integration within community, immersion within the nature itself, where maybe in the United States we're not surrounded by these kinds of things. We're more individualistic. We look out for ourselves. It's 9 to 5 rush kind of lifestyle. And there you're focused on healing one another. And then maybe your journey coming back to the States, you realized you had to develop a little bit more of those qualities after being away for so long. Okay, responsibility, integrity, grounded presence, embracing the difficult work that needs to be done. And that's a very transformational journey that most people don't get to experience in the United States. We're kind of isolated here. I want to hone in for a second on the plant medicine world and why that specifically was so transformational to you. What did that
Mhm.
do for you specifically?
Yeah. I mean, admittedly, now looking back, I can see that plant medicine is becoming like just a central component of the work that I do, and I think I'm just very much called to this work. That said, I definitely have recognized it in the journeys of many others, certainly my own, where, there are just, and it's not to say that everybody's journey will look like this. I don't think everybody necessarily needs to go on a plant medicine retreat or have a plant medicine journey, but it does, when it's done in a good way, especially when it's held by like indigenous healers and you're in a safe space and you have the space to really land in that experience and process whatever comes up and maybe learn some integration skills. It can be one of the most potent opportunities to evolve our consciousness and to gain access not only to the storehouse of traumas and different things that live in the body from, our childhood and beyond, which we know has such a significant influence in how we show up in our relationships and in the world. But that sometimes those things are so deeply just embedded and they're so kind of far beneath the surface, they don't really get an opportunity to gain. We don't gain access to those things unless we go through like a really powerful process or we go through like a plant medicine journey, which seems to almost always, again, when it's kind of framed in this healing way, like the indigenous healers, always do it, that stuff comes bubbling forth. And we have an opportunity to not only process it emotionally, but also it seems to help us weave a new story around it and create new meaning around it, which then, actually helps it to become like a gift, right, in our life. And it just seems like the plant medicines, whether it's ayahuasca or ibogaine or psilocybin, they all seem to do that in their own way. And again, I think it then also offers us some inspiration. We often get either visions or just inklings about, now what are we supposed to do with this? Yes, now we've processed these things and we've maybe felt that unity consciousness and we feel that love coming online or we feel that warriorship coming. Whatever those things are that were sort of disintegrated in us. We feel them coming online. Okay, now what are we to do with them? And usually we get, little inklings about who we are to be, what is our service? becoming? What is our gift to the community? And again, I mean, there are many, many pathways to gaining those answers. Um, but for those who resonate with this kind of path, I mean, it's one of the more obvious access points. Um, Now, I'm not necessarily a proponent of like constantly doing plant medicine work and like doing it forever. I do think that there's a component of like, there's this idea of like once you've got the message, put down the phone sort of thing. I do think that there's something valuable about going through the healing work, gaining access to the vision and figuring out what those capacities are, and then doing that integration work, which in my life sometimes has spanned years. Sometimes there's been literally years between my plant medicine journeys because I've been in the thick of the world learning how to actually embody it and ground it and anchor it in. And I think people would do well to lean into that. So all that said, I just think it's one of the more potent and valuable resources we have to accessing that material.
It's amazing also that you get to experience them in the indigenous settings as you did, traditional ayahuasca ceremony, traditional psilocybin ceremony. And these things are becoming more popular in the West, right? Like we have we have integrated psilocybin psychotherapy sessions now, where psilocybin's becoming illegal or legal in places like Colorado and California. Peyote has obviously been legal in reservation settings and church settings. But these things are becoming more to the forefront, and we have MDMA therapy as well, and ketamine assisted therapy. And we might classically know a lot of these things as psychedelics, right? You refer to them as plant medicines. And I actually have a question there, which is why is the term plant medicine so important as
Mhm.
opposed to what we use in the West of psychedelic?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much resistance to the term psychedelic, but I will say, I think plant medicine just seems to encapsulate things in a certain way, and in the spaces that I've been in the retreat centers that I've worked in, which in my opinion have been some of the best in the world. Plant medicine just seems to land in a certain way and just seems to resonate in a certain way, and so that's the language that I use. In some ways, even plant medicine is sort of imperfect, but yeah, that's just what resonates most.
You mentioned as well the importance of community in all of this.
Mhm.
Why was community such a major aspect to your transformation in that time?
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that's still very much evolving for me. For me, growing up, I was kind of an introverted, kind of quiet child, and I I don't think socially I had like a really incredible skill set. I think kind of struggled as far as like making friends and maintaining friends. And we moved when I was in my teen years from Fort Lauderdale to Pensacola, which was a big culture shift. My family were also Jehovah's Witnesses, so that was like already that's a group that they set themselves apart. They have certain beliefs and they kind of like stick to their own. And yet I never really resonated even with that within that community. So on many different levels, I felt kind of like a black sheep or just sort of isolated, lone wolf archetype kind of energy. And that said, I feel like I've found ways to survive and make that work for me. And yet, as I got older, um, that you can't ignore that loneliness, right? Even though in my early 20s I was like indulging in a lot of, recreational drugs and this sort of thing, I think to sort of numb that out, it just became more and more clear that I had this kind of deep loneliness, right? This deep longing for connection. And I think living in Peru, living in Costa Rica, being involved in this work, it's like it's so beautiful because not only are you super connected to these traditions and through to the indigenous healers, but it's like these little communities of the facilitators and the people kind of helping it all be organized. Um, you're just living in this beautiful lifestyle. You're doing this good work. You're eating this good food. You're in this beautiful environment. You just get so closely knit. And then you're hosting these sometimes fairly large groups of like 15 to 20 people, and sometimes they're there for a week, sometimes they're there for longer, but those groups are often showing up with a really deep yearning and a really deep desire, and they're spending lots of money to come travel, and they're usually having something really quite pressing on their heart. And so it just makes for the opportunity for a lot of depth and a lot of richness in those moments. And so I think that too is part of the healing. It's like part of this whole process is how we come together and we spend a lot of time in those retreats just listening to each other, listening to the visions that are coming up, listening to the dreams we're having at night, helping each other process what do these things mean, what's on the horizon, what needs to be kind of further worked with. Um, and I think, again, that was a big part of the healing. And I think a big part of what became so obvious in the struggle of leaving all that behind to come back home, to the States after being away for so many years, it's like all of a sudden I didn't have those same connections. And all of a sudden, the connections that I hadn't seen these people in many years. And I was kind of a completely different person when I knew them. And so that was part of the challenge too. And I think part of the drive of the men's work was to like establish some form of intentional community. Um, because certainly by now I can see that, the close friends that I've cultivated, the communities that I've been a part of and kind of helped cultivate, it's through these relationships too, especially it's like, again, to speak to what I brought up earlier, it's like it's great to have the peak experience and the beautiful retreat, and that is one part of the healing. But then the integration is a big part of the rest of it, is actually living it out in your life. And we don't live in isolation. We live in relationship to others, and not just the people that we live in our home, like our spouse, etc. But it's also all that, just that web of connection, our friends and people in the community and people in our career space, etc. And like we know that one of the biggest regrets of people, as they're dying is that they didn't, get to enjoy these relationships. They didn't make space for these connections. They didn't get to, they were focused on too many other things. It's really the quality of the relationships that amounts to a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. And so all that said, a big piece of like what I'm involved with now is just like keeping that in mind. It's not that the communities need to be so, in my case, need to be so big and so vast, but I think there is something about finding those values that align and finding that tribe. I know that comes up a lot, that word, and really putting in the work to maintain and enrich and deepen those relationships. Because again, I think on the long term, that's also how we sustain not only our own kind of self-development and fulfillment and betterment, but also how we have a lasting impact on the community for the future.
Yeah, you mentioned before we started this call that the healing journey in the West has taken on this very individualistic tone to it. And really healing is done in a community setting for the most part. We connect with ourselves. Yes, we understand our own inner worlds through things like contemplation and the plant medicine work and meditation and psychotherapy and things like this. And then it's about expressing that. It's about doing the unblocking work to really embody all of those deep values that have been cultivated within, bringing that out and expressing it. And that's done through interaction with other people and interaction with our families, and we can't keep it to ourselves forever. That's the next step in the journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think this was another piece that I think we were talking about earlier, and I'd love to weave in here that I'm not a terribly political person, but I think anybody, can look out into the world, what's going on in our country, in America, look out, geopolitically, just like across the world, especially in the Middle East. I have some family ancestry there, and I'm quite sensitive to like what's happening in Israel, etc. And it can be very overwhelming, all of the suffering, all the layers of complexity of all the things that are going on. And I think on the most fundamental level, um, one of the most potent kind of forms of activism, excuse me, that we have available is not only doing our personal healing work and tending to our own hearts and just working on our own self, our self-development, but then also living that out in a way where we tighten and strengthen the bonds, not just in our family, but in our community around us, and then start to think about, okay, how do we improve the lives of our children? How do we tend to the environment in which we live? How do we improve the quality of our lives? How do we improve the quality of our health? And as we start to kind of create that coherence, because right now, just as an aside, I'm sure everybody can relate to this, social media, the regular kind of traditional forms of media, it's like they're always encouraging this kind of friction, right? And there's this very kind of oppositional energy, and it's almost like celebrated to be like hating on the other side and saying that the other side is basically the devil, right? Like they're the reason that we don't have A, B, or C. And yet like that's part of that's all a facade, right? Because we have far more in common than we do otherwise. It's just that we are like buying into these narratives and we're avoiding, anytime that you're looking at somebody else and you're saying, oh, you're so terrible, it's like oftentimes those same qualities live in you. You're just not taking the time to really acknowledge that and be with that and feel those things because that's challenging and that's confronting. And oftentimes we don't have the support to do that, right? So all that said, I have been feeling this awakening kind of drive to weave in that layer of the work, which I know a lot of us, we don't, especially in this field, like we don't feel so like we want to be like politically like, like rah rah out there. And yet, this is something that's accessible. This is something that's very grounded. And it's just very obvious that we would, again, tend to ourselves, tend to our own communities, strengthen those bonds, bring back some of that power that has been very kind of like centralized, where there's a lot of decisions and a lot of like money moving around that is not really reflective of the interests of the population. And so that then we can start to, again, not only improve the quality of our communities, but as that happens over time across the country, then maybe we could actually start to shift the tides. And that just feels accessible and just yeah, just again another layer of the work that feels inspiring for me.
It's literally close to us, right? It starts with us and it feels
Hmm.
accessible because we have a say in it. It's not something
Right,
that we're playing into a gigantic entity that's been around for a very long time, and maybe we see the faults in it. But
right.
it's saying, okay, I'm gonna work on me and I'm gonna turn myself into a healthy individual, a healthy cell that creates a healthy cellular system that creates a healthy organ system that is the community. And
Yeah,
that keeps branching outwardly and outwardly.
yeah,
And again, you mentioned these indigenous traditions. They knew these things. If you look at Hindu culture and Indian culture, Buddhism that sprouted out from those, and then you go into things like Amazonian tribes. They live very close with the land and they understand the connections between everything. The word yoga means union. Everything's going back to connection and connection to ourselves, one another, and life itself. And from there, you talk a lot about your decisions and going towards men's work. So how has men's work been impactful to you, and why do you see that as a necessity, maybe to incorporate in your life and the lives of
yeah,
other men?
yeah, beautiful. Um, Again, it's something that for me was very necessary. It was like a nutrient that I was deficient in for so long. Again, I didn't have my father growing up. I didn't really have any obvious like male role models that were like really involved in my life. And so once I became an adult, I just really struggled with a number of things that I think, typically you might absorb from like your father or like your male role models. And so for me, it just has like a personal relevance and significance. And I recognize that as I lean into this work and being more involved with it and leading in these spaces, that it's deeply nourishing for me. I'm still like growing in that capacity, in my capacities for leadership, in my capacities for integrity, in my capacities to like commit to things and follow through, and be open to feedback, and also just like the sharpening that takes place when we have sort of brothers at our side and that we trust, that we kind of invite in to, highlight areas that maybe we're lacking or maybe we're ignoring and these sorts of things. And again, I think these are the particular communities where you can gain access to these pieces that otherwise, because for example, there are a number of really beautiful kind of spiritual communities, but oftentimes they do have a bit of more of like a feminine essence to them, as makes sense. Spirituality has kind of a lot of kind of a feminine essence to it, especially when we're talking about yoga, talking about our feelings, emotions, these sorts of things. And that's all beautiful and that's all like very helpful. And yet for men, especially when we're like considering the fact that for a variety of reasons, like testosterone is declining, we are literally becoming more feminine as men. And from my vantage point, that isn't necessarily a positive. And I think a lot of women echo that as well. Like a lot of women want their men to like show up as leaders and be masculine and be sort of very grounded and be somebody that they can lean on and rely on. And yet there is like literally environmental factors that are sort of like chipping away at our capacity to do that. And so does, all of the comforts of life and social media and, you know, the for example, like when we look at our children of this generation, a lot of their heroes do not look like the heroes of our generation or of our parents' generation. They are YouTubers, they are, and not that there's anything particularly wrong with that, but they are kind of childlike, they're kind of soft, they're kind of, some of them feminine. And again, nothing wrong with that per se, but as we become adults, and as we become fathers, if that's our desire, as we become leaders in our community, there is a necessity for these masculine qualities. And if you don't have um, spaces where you can really cultivate those qualities, because it takes practice and it takes cultivation and it literally takes community and brotherhood in this case, it's like those things don't come naturally, because they're not easy things. And so, all that said, I think to become very well-rounded, in this case, men, it's a necessary component for me, at least that's what I've found. And so, again, for this generation of men that are facing all these challenges, for this generation of men that a lot of us didn't have our fathers around, that's something that's like we know a lot of fathers just kind of, for whatever variety of reasons, they didn't show up for their families, they left their families. A lot of us were raised by single women. Again, it's like there's this call to action to kind of like, okay, we didn't have that growing up, but we still have to face the challenges of being a man in this world with all of these things going on around us. The men's work just seems to be a natural response to that. And it's just an arena where we can focus in on these qualities. And it seems to be more accessible when men get together specifically with that aim. We can kind of quicken that process of developing those capacities.
And what pops in my mind as well, again, is the indigenous traditions you were talking about. Maybe in some cultures there were rites of passages where boys had to go through a process like the vision quest to become a man. And this process of becoming a man isn't, again, common in Western culture. So going through difficulties to develop the strength, to develop the vision, to develop the determination. Maybe we don't see that in our culture today.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're spot on. I mean, many indigenous cultures, when you look at them, and this isn't to romanticize them because there are things that they didn't have right as well. But as far as this piece goes, yes, like you had a village to raise you. It wasn't just your father, it was also your uncles. It was also like all of the tribe was there as far as like masculine role models. You would learn skills from all sorts of people, and that there were these very specific, often traditions that were passed down over many generations of like, okay, when they're coming of this age or when they're showing an interest in the opposite sex or when they're when they're showing a certain level of maturation, okay, now it's time. We gather all these young men. We often put them through some form of ritual, some form of series of ritual and ceremonies where they go through a very challenging, very obvious, very distinct process where they're taken away from the village. They are not with their mothers, they are not with their sisters anymore, and they are pushed to their edge in some capacity. And I mean, in some villages, it's like well known that like they push this so far as to like some of the young men don't survive. Like it's that challenging. Um, Now, maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be that dire, but in any case, it's to go through a literal transformation of leaving behind the boy persona and being then as they survive that, you have tested yourself, you have proven yourself worthy. Now you are invited back into the community and you are not who you were. You are a man now. You take on new responsibilities. You are respected. You are addressed in a certain way. You speak different words now. We speak different words to you. And it's just a very obvious invitation and like literal transformation into something distinctly different, right? And that's part of keeping the community healthy and viable. Because there's you know a number of different aphorisms and metaphors that talk about when young men are not initiated or when they don't have these processes, there is like a fire that builds in them. There is like an angst where they will destroy themselves and they will destroy the community if they don't have these processes in place. And I think that that's very true. And I think if you look around at the culture, we see that, whether we're talking about the suicide rates of men or whether we're looking at the rates of depression, et cetera. When we don't have like this culture intact and these ways of initiating young men into their adulthood, there is like a sense of just confusion with that fire that men naturally have, especially at those ages, where it can become very destructive, very self-destructive, especially. So yeah, I think that that's a very important piece that also is almost always woven in to these men's work organizations, and many of them also generally eventually have some like youth program where like young men are invited into that and they can go through something resembling what we just described, sort of like this rite of passage.
From my own life, I did karate and martial arts from when I was very young. And still with my counseling clients, I recommend any of these younger kids to go through some sort of a martial art. And I grew up in a house with four women, three sisters and my mom, and then my dad.
Mhm.
So I was surrounded by sensitivity and emotional intelligence and these kinds of feminine qualities. But I needed to do something that was more disciplined, structured, strength oriented to develop those masculine qualities like you're talking about. And I'm curious in your own work, what do you usually incorporate to help people develop some of these qualities?
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a number of modalities that go into men's work, and there are a number of kind of ways to go about it. I do like to try to work as holistically as possible. And so, for example, like a framework that often gets woven in, which is kind of like a foundational men's work text, is King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And so we have the king, warrior, magician, lover. These are archetypes, these are capacities that every man has, and there are many others, but these are sort of like foundational ones. And so then as we look at those, we can see there are kind of different practices that might bring up different material as it relates to, for example, like the warrior. So we all have this inner warrior capacity. This would be the one that is works with boundaries. So establishing boundaries, knowing how to enforce boundaries when people press upon them, knowing how to be sort of very disciplined, committed. It also, I think, it has a component of like the health and vitality of our body, of keeping our bodies in fighting shape, so to speak. And when it's out of balance, of course, it's like we don't have that capacity. Maybe we're a bit lazy. We're just like, oh yeah, that's okay. Like the boundaries are very fluid, and that can cause a lot of issues in our life. And so, for example, with the warrior, as it relates to like a retreat or any kind of experiences, that's where something like sacred combat can come in, where it's not just us, putting on boxing gloves and going after each other, but it's all of the sort of introductory work to frame it in a way of like, we're not just here to hurt each other, we're here to sharpen each other. We're here to awaken certain things that, again, otherwise might lay dormant, because we've all grown up with some kind of relationship around what it means to get into a fight, to get into some kind of physical altercation. There's fear, there's not knowing how to do it. Maybe we were bullies and maybe we got into fights more often than we maybe should have. Maybe we were the aggressors, and like there's all this rich material that again otherwise sort of just lies dormant or gets triggered in a moment and then we just react. Then here we have an opportunity to access it. We put on the gloves, we go after each other, but then we look into each other's eyes, we breathe, we feel what's coming up for you. In some cases, those interactions can lead us into deep, deep somatic processes where guys are just like completely accessing these incredibly potent emotions. And then we get to do kind of gestalt work or, work where we create scenarios where we can kind of then again make new meaning regarding those feelings and those histories. And again, just the boxing is sort of an entryway to that. And every facet of those archetypes, for example, has corresponding practices that allow us to kind of deeper dive into it, feel those things, gain new access, create new meanings. And so that's just kind of one example. Mhm.
Yeah, from my counseling work, I also see that men tend to have the easy access to anger, but
Yeah,
there's not a whole lot of familiarity with it or control over it. So when you're going to something like you're calling sacred fighting or the martial arts, it allows them to hone in on it and learn how to utilize it in a protective and appropriate manner,
yeah,
instead of something that comes out kind of wildly. And it's
yeah.
very, very important.
Anger does come up so often for men, and it is such a potent emotion, and it's such an important emotion. And as we know, like emotions are not good or bad, it's just energy, it's just information. But for example, if we don't have an education, if we don't have a good relationship with anger, if we haven't tended to kind of like our inner landscape and again just worked with the dynamics of anger that we carry, then oftentimes what might happen is, for example, you're talking to your wife or something happens with your child and you get triggered and then you kind of explode onto them and you project this anger onto them and it harms them. And you don't mean to do that, but it's like there's sort of this reaction that is sort of just beneath the surface and it kind of spills out. But again, as men get access to these kinds of spaces and this kind of work, and they can, in a controlled setting, access that anger. Oh, wow, this is powerful. This is potent. Gain a new understanding. Oh, anger is not bad. It's just something that arises when a boundary is being crossed. Oh, when did my boundaries first get? Oh, there's that deep tenderness. Oh, yeah, I remember when my boundaries were crossed. Ah, making new meaning. Okay. And so there's this new capacity, this new understanding. Now I actually have some kind of control around that anger of not like, oh no, I never need to get angry. No, sometimes you need to get angry. If somebody's confronting you or somebody's trying to hurt you or your family, or, sometimes you need that anger to mobilize, but you need to have control of it, right? It needs to be sort of under your control. And so again, I just wanted to touch on that because anger is a very important piece that comes up in these spaces.
Very well said. And I'll also say that there's also this stereotype that men have to be very strong and can only show that aggressive style of anger. But there's a component of vulnerability that also adds to strength when we're emotionally intelligent and we're able to control our emotions and notice them and recognize them and let them out in healthy manners, then that seems to be a true level of strength. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, um, I think it was Carl Jung that was like famously had this quote of, I don't aim to be a good man, I aim to be a whole man. And so what I take from that, it's like we want to just be our character fully developed. We want to have access to all of it. Um, Not just maybe what's stereotypically deemed as masculine, but like all of it. Like if my child comes to me with something that's tender for them, I want to be able to feel that tenderness in me. I want the tears to be ready to flow. I want to be able to empathize. I want to be able to see somebody struggling and like I can feel that struggle in me. I want my heart to be open. And when somebody's crossing a boundary or when I need to make a boundary clear to somebody, I don't want to be so in my sensitivity that like, ooh, I'm afraid to do that because it's going to ruffle some feathers and then that there might be a conflict. I don't want to be afraid of conflict either. I want to have the full range of capacity because any life that's worth living is going to demand such an array of skills and capacities from us. And so we have to have like all of these available to us, that sensitivity, that depth, you know, especially in partnership, like you said, there are some expectations about men, but we do like anybody that's in a relationship with a man wants not just his stoic capacity and his ability to be kind of like a strong kind of unshakable force or a mountain, but they also want to be able to like feel his heart. Not that he's always so like sad and in his emotions and always kind of like going through like something, but that he has the capacity that if there is something tender in the moment, that he's there, that he's responsive, that he actually feels it, and that it's obvious. Because sometimes we become sort of stone-like, and that doesn't serve anyone either. So again, it's that idea of becoming really whole in all of who we are, so that we can show up to all of the demands of our life.
And that translates into both work in men and women. There's both qualities that we need to develop. We need to develop both feminine, stereotypically feminine qualities, which are more creativity, flow, gentleness, nurturing, and maybe more masculine qualities like strength, support, and determination, integrity, things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well said.
John, are there any final messages you would like to leave with the audience today?
Just wanted to encourage anybody, for example, if anybody is listening to this, yeah, I imagine you hold certain values, and I just want to celebrate you for being curious. And again, I think anyone listening to this is has a desire to grow, to a desire to deepen themselves. And I think that that's really beautiful and it's commendable. And so just for anybody listening to this, just wishing you well on your journey, encouraging you to deepen. Also, too, like I'm here as a resource if anybody feels inclined to, if you're curious about the work that I do, if you're curious, even not necessarily about working with me, but about learning about what plant medicine retreats are recommended or valuable or things to consider, whether like, are you ready for this sort of work, etc., or whether it regards the men's work. I know a lot of guys have a resistance to this sort of thing, and there's a lot of cultural ideas around men's work and etc. And so just wanting to encourage people to continue in their path, celebrating those who are already working in those ways, and just again, inviting anybody who feels inclined to lean in and reach out. I'm here as a resource.
John, Thank you for joining us. It's always good to be in your very grounded presence, and I appreciate your friendship. Thank you for being here.
Mm, likewise. A pleasure, man. Thank you again.
John, where can people find you? Instagram, website?
Yeah, primarily most of my activity is on Instagram. And so that's, if I remember correctly, it's at John, John underscore Hazim is my last name. H-A-Z as in zebra, I-M as in marble.
There we have it. And if you'd like to learn more about John, go to his Instagram, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us for Clarity.